and perhaps it's common to other EMEs also. Very often, in this case it was a global crisis, but very often EMEs get into a crisis when there is a political instability. If that happens, then it's the central bank, the FISC cannot take the lead. So the way I look at it is, there perhaps in EMEs, the central bank rather than the government. I mean, ultimately it has to be the central bank or the government. So the central bank it's preferable if there are possibilities of elections and political instability. Therefore, there may be certain advantage in giving the assurance that the stability is sort of in the hands of professional central bank. And that was the experience in May, and we were able to pull through with full intervention as needed. Now, as far as monetary policy or macroprudential, sectoral or across the board, I think, like again, I learned from Governor Jalan, from the multiple indicators, you also go to multiple objectives, multiple indicators, multiple instruments. And you cannot have a preordained view as to what should be taken first and what should be next. So the way I look at it is, the policymakers should have all the instruments at hand. And for instance, if you find that there is a bubble, but it is essentially concentrated around housing or real estate, then you target it more. We know all resources are fungible, but even in spite of fungibility, there will be some effect that happens. So you must, and in any case, they cannot be inconsistent. The monetary policy cannot be inconsistent with macroprudential norms. And so, in a way, almost all during the period that we are talking, the interest rates were higher, were moving up rather than down. More, in fact, there was greater threat of moving it further, which ensured that the markets were on guard. There is no need to increase interest rates if you threaten to increase. Half the time the threat works. And second is, the macroprudential have to go in hand, because at least they cannot be in contradiction. So I essentially would say the sequencing, the packaging will depend on the context and how that boom or bubble is occurring, where it is occurring, and what is the source. If the source is external liquidity, then you handle the external liquidity. If the source is excess credit in households, then handle household credit. So ultimately, the leverage can be compartmentalized in spite of relationship between household, corporate, financial sector. So I would put it all three, not in contradiction, harmonious, sequencing and packaging depending on the source of the instability that you are perceiving.
Now, both your answers actually lead me to a question that I do not have in my notes, which is, you are suggesting that the Reserve Bank should have a responsibility for financial stability. That's obvious, of course, but should also have an explicitly defined and understood responsibility for financial stability. In other words, that if there is uncertainty, if there is instability, people should know that the Reserve Bank will step in. That will happen only if, in either explicitly or by convention, the Reserve Bank is accepted as the institution with central responsibility for financial stability. You know, when we made a plea before the FSLRC, that is the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, that the Finance Minister referred to yesterday, their report is now out. But when they were in session, we from the Reserve Bank went and made a request to them in our submission that financial stability must be explicitly defined in the mandate of the Reserve Bank. And we gave quite a cogent, well-written paper in support of that position, but the FSLRC, in their wisdom, did not accept that suggestion. What's your view on that? That in the mandate of the Reserve Bank, should financial stability be explicitly defined, understanding, of course, that the Reserve Bank cannot be the exclusive overseer of financial stability?
I anticipated this. That's why I started my answer with saying I'll draw only on my experience, not the current context.
On your experience.
So, drawing on my experience, whatever I said is entirely drawing on the experience of 2004, when the old government was voted out of power. There was uncertainty about the new government. There was certain instability, and there was a feeling that when we get in other words, if there is an explicit, at least let me put it this way, at that point of time, if there was an explicit responsibility of a government to handle stability, And if the government itself was unstable, there would be a vacuum. So that was my view. Now, what it will be now, I don't know. I don't know. Thanks.
All right, let me move to another question that comes up whenever we talk about macroprudential instruments and financial stability, which is central bank autonomy. Central bank autonomy to conduct monetary policy, central bank autonomy to conduct macroprudential policy. We had some discussion on this yesterday about independence of central banks, and there was some view that central banks should be autonomous, but also that autonomy should not be unfettered. We all understand the rationale for autonomy of the central bank for monetary policy. However, all central bank governors, some of them in public, almost everyone in private, admits of pressures. Again, going back to Alan Greenspan's interview, which I read only recently, he says in that interview that in a democratic society, it is difficult, if not impossible, to lean against the wind. So all this talk about leaning against the wind, removing the punch bowl, is difficult to remove the punch bowl, and some people referred to this yesterday in a boom time. Implementing countercyclical policy is just not possible. So in India too, we see this clamor for RBI reducing interest rates and RBI being a party pooper, not understanding the needs of the economy, etc. Do you think that in a democratic society, you've written about the issues beyond monetary policy, you've written about democracy, about governance issues. Do you think it's possible for the Reserve Bank of India to be independent in conducting its monetary policy? Draw on your experience, not just as the governor, but also as a member of parliament.
No, I think that this whole question of autonomy, to my mind, is overstretched. Particularly, I'm talking about a developing country like ours. And since you asked me to talk about the experience, now, we faced, the Asian crisis was a big blow because we had, exchange reserves were not zero, but they were very small. And we were losing, when the Asian crisis began, 6-7 billion or 1/3 or 1/4 of our reserves in 1 week, because nobody expected our rate of exchange to be realistic or allow, say, the free movement of exchange rate or to exchange rate to be depreciating, to take care of the kind of pressure which was coming in regard to what you might call confidence. So on the question of autonomy in any country, I believe, or rather particularly in our kind of country, it's of utmost importance to have a consonance, or what you might call a view, which is both shared by the government, because government is ultimately responsible to Parliament. Government is irrespective of whatever fiscal policy dimensions are, whatever economic dimensions are. Politics does trump economy, and unless you have the government on your side, you get into a lot of problems. And if you're dealing with issues which are difficult to handle, then a consultative and a consonance, an approach which is devised by the government and RBI together is of utmost importance. And since you asked me about, let me give you the example. Again, this is historical, so I can say, in the midst of the Asian, and I keep on referring to the Asian crisis because that was the biggest jolt and biggest, very extremely difficult thing to handle. Our reserves were not very high. We lost 5-6 billion Usha or something in a week. And the orthodoxy, not orthodoxy, the policy was that exchange rate should be stable. Not necessarily fixed, but should be stable. At that particular point of time, it was that if we were trying to protect the exchange rate within the range, as it were, within, say, at that time it was 35, 36, if I wanted to keep, and there was the government view of 40, it should be no more than 40, that any exchange rate that you like to say and target is going to be flawed. that you can't keep that target, because the markets then would know that you can't keep it, you don't have enough resources to handle it. So they would, and you know how it happens, futures and present, and there are few operators which guide the whole movement. We had, at that particular point of time, I'm bringing this particular issue because you asked about this autonomy of the Reserve Bank, and we have some of the deputy governors who were there, and at that particular point of time. You know, so there was United Front government, and the present finance minister was also the finance minister of that government. And the word that we use for depreciation is rupee is falling. Nobody wants to fall.